Well, today is the second and final day of indirect talks in Kazakhstan between the Syrian government and opposition forces. Russia, Turkey, and Iran have issued a joint statement saying that they plan to establish a trilateral mechanism to safeguard the Syrian ceasefire and to support the UN-led talks in Geneva. In today's talks, the opposition criticized the joint statement, saying that they were unhappy that it didn't single out Iran's military role in Syria. Now, the talks are the first negotiations between the main parties involved in the 6-year-long conflict. They include neither the UN nor any Western powers. Well, joining me at the big table now is a well-known face here on the day, security analyst Daniel Gerlach. Daniel, it's good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you.
And for the Russian perspective tonight, we have Maxim Sukhov. He is with the Russian International Affairs Council, a diplomatic think tank, and he's an editor also at Al Monitor's Mideast. Maxim, it's good to have you with us tonight. Daniel, let me start with you. What should be the headline for the end of these talks?
Isn't it your responsibility to read the headlines? Well, you know, I've talked to Western diplomats earlier today, and they've all been somehow disillusioned with what's been going on for the last couple of months, of course. So they're ready to accept anything coming out of Astana. And at least I think there is a positive change here with all the criticism that is attached to it. They feel that the Russians are being serious about trying to get a political solution. And they also feel that the Russians have no exit strategy to get out of this mess in Syria. And this is why they really want to have a political solution. So this is not just a camouflage operation to pretend you're interested in a political solution, but you want one. Like how you handle it and how you manage it, what kind of reality you live in, that's another story.
Maxim, let me pick up then with you. What's your take on this from the eyes of Russia? I mean, do these talks, do they mark a victory for Russia in kickstarting the peace process where, as I mentioned earlier, the United States is not present?
Well, I think I could just reiterate the argument that the guests in the studio mentioned. I think the Russians are serious about the talks, and I think the perception in Moscow is that also other parties in conflict are serious, because there seems to be this Syria fatigue raising in Europe and Russia and in the Middle East. And I think the Russians coming out of the talks are slightly optimistic, but I would personally characterize the talks as a moderate progress. Whether you want to emphasize the word moderate or the progress, I think will remains to be seen until the next round of the talks in Geneva on February the 8th.
Do you think, Maxim, that Russia wants the U.S. to remain somewhat sidelined, particularly as we move forward to those talks in Geneva?
Well, actually, it's a very good question, because I think prior to the talks, there have been very extensive contacts between Russian Foreign Ministry and Trump's administration, and working through the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And they took the invitation, but I think the response was that given the circumstances, the transition character of the administration, the Americans just wanted to preserve the observer status, which I think is works for them in this circumstance. And actually, that was a point of contingency between Moscow and Tehran, because Tehran knowingly strongly opposed U.S. presence in the talks. Well, I think, however, this is important. What happened in Astana, that it transforms the Geneva talks to the point where the militant opposition groups will now be present in Geneva as well.
And it's interesting, too, Daniel, the invitation to the Americans to be observers here came at the last minute. I was reading today. So there, at the beginning, there was no plan for an invitation to go out.
Yeah,
so
and even European diplomats were surprised that the Americans wouldn't send a delegation. Look, I think the implicit message coming out from here is, even though the Russians are not saying this explicitly, not to embarrass what they think new ally in the White House, but the message is, look, if you let us do our job, if you had ever let us have do it earlier, if the US hadn't tried to counter our strategy for a political solution, we would have succeeded much earlier. And
But then you're talking about Assad, though, right?
well, I'm talking about the Russian position on it. And what is also interesting, the armed opposition that is now being courted in Astana to sign communiques, even though they refuse it, and to attend the talks, to attend directly the talks, they had been called terrorists, and they had been unqualified by, of course, the Syrian regime and its Russian ally earlier in the Geneva talks. So this is some kind of an irony. But again, expectations have been quite low. And so everything that's coming out of these talks is being somehow appreciated.
So what are you expecting then moving forward to the Geneva talks in February?
Look, the opposition is tired of this war, and so are the people in Syria, the people who are loyal to the Syrian regime, whatever. But the problem here is the fact that the war between these opposition factions and the regime, let's assume that there is a chance that it's going to be over. That doesn't mean that the war in Syria is over, because there is a big elephant in the room, a big problem around somehow everybody is going around, but around everybody is gathering, and why everybody is there, which is the Kurds, which is the PYD, which is the Kurdish project in the north of Syria, which somehow is where the interest of the Syrian regime, the interest of other regional powers and Turkey converge. And this is the reason why they all gathered and the Turks subscribed to these negotiations. And the PYD is, of course, not attending it because Russia tries to untangle the problems, which is a good thing. But are we seeing another war ahead with the Kurds? Are we seeing that Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, is expanding at the same time while in Astana we are talking about a political solution? Daesh is making inroads in the south. The Syrian regime proves that it's much more unstable than it pretends to be. So I think Russia has really some big, not only political but also military problems on the ground, and it better comes up with a solution.
Maxime, do you agree with Daniel? I mean, at the end of the day, an outsider looking at this could say that Russia is just playing things quietly now and waiting for Geneva to let the Americans get in and take control so that they can clean up the mess.
Well, actually, yeah, I think the thing is that the Russians have made a principled political decision to change the vector of the peace guarantors from Americans and Europeans to Iranians and Turks, which Moscow thinks have much higher stakes in the conflict. So I think the mood in Moscow is that now, with these regional stakeholders being key negotiators and mediators in the talks, things may actually stick together for much longer because, as the guests in the studio mentioned, there have been rather mutual, of course, dissatisfaction with both within Moscow and Washington over each other's actions. But I think at the end of the day, the time lapse between now and what happens in the Geneva talks, what happens within this time lapse is critical, because if the ceasefire falls apart, which have been the case in previously numerous times, then I think that the situation gets real messy. And as was mentioned, the ISIS is growing, and you have the primary I think approach that the Moscow tried to suggest was to compartmentalize the projects, trying to put at the negotiating table Syrian government and this Syrian opposition, then together deal with Daesh, and then talk about the power transaction and future Syrian peace political process. And I think Russians also handed the project of a draft constitution to the Syrian opposition today, which is important.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there, gentlemen. Maxime Sukhov with the Russian International Affairs Council, and of course a familiar face with us here on the day, Daniel Gerlach. To both of you, gentlemen, thank you very much.